Hello, so welcome to another video. So in this one we're going to be looking at taking a scene. You don't really need much for a scene. All you really have to have is some kind of ground plane, at least in Maya, and an object, I suppose, that you want to use with HDR imagery. And we're going to look at, in this one, working with the copy of the car that we're using so far for our projects, and using the V-Ray render engine. So we're going to be importing that into a scene and looking at lighting the scene using the V-Ray light dome with our HDR, and also then creating sort of matte shadow materials so that we can actually cast a shadow onto our ground. So what we've got here is we've got our background shot. So this is a kind of bit, we can see a little bit. If I look at my wireframe view here, we can see our entire shot, and this is an image plane for our camera. Now it's not uncommon if you're working with image planes of your camera, especially if you've downloaded some files or something like that, or moved computers, that this won't actually show up correctly even if you've had it on previously. So sometimes what you'll need to do is sort of select your camera, so the camera that's got the plane on it, and then somewhere on that camera in the attribute editor you will see there is an image plane shape, and down there there'll be the image plane attributes, and this will be your image name. So if you've kind of just lost track of it or something, you can just kind of click this folder, go and find out where your undistorted images are. So these are undistorted images that we undistorted in Nuke, and just bring that in, and then that'll bring in a still image. If you've actually got a range of frames, just make sure you've got that use image sequence turned on, and then as you scrub through here it will update with the current image. This is a static shot, so they're all pretty similar. Right, okay, so we've got a camera matched in here, and I've actually created a couple of simple pieces of geometry, so very little. If I look in my perspective view, I can see what we've got. We've basically got our matched camera, we've got a bit of a ground plane, and we've got a couple of boxes basically that are positioned to kind of be in the same position as these kind of walls here. So when I look through my camera, they'll be sort of vaguely well matched. Yeah, they're in kind of pretty much the right positions. My ground plane's looking fairly reasonable. Right, so that's fine. So what I'm going to do first is just import a model. So I'm just going to go to File. Now this model was actually modeled by a chap called Ben Carl Thomas. So his website is bct.me, so you could check that out. He's got lots of good tutorials and things like that on there. So that's a great asset. So if I just go into our library folder here, it's in Assets, Characters, Beetle, and in the reference we have a Beetle object. Okay, so that's going to bring in this Beetle group into my scene somewhere. If I just look in my perspective view, there it is. It's kind of off camera just at the moment. So I'm just going to move this so I can actually see it through my camera. So I'm just going to select the move control there and just pull this Beetle somewhere so it's kind of in this kind of gap that where my baseline was, maybe a little bit forward even of that. There we go. Maybe rotate it a little bit just so it's kind of like got a bit of a side view. Okay, how's that looking in my camera? Okay, not too bad. It's kind of vaguely in a reasonable position. I may just rotate it a little more around, maybe have a bit more of a side view. There we are. Perfect. Maybe even nudge it a little bit. Maybe nudge it back that way a little, maybe forward a little. Okay, am I liking that? Yep, I quite like that position. Right, so I've just got my object in this scene. Now, right now I haven't set up any render settings at all, so I'm just going to make sure that my render settings seem sensible. So I'm going to go into Maya's render settings. Now, this is a V-Ray object, it's got V-Ray materials, so I'm going to make sure I'm going to set this up for V-Ray. Now, I'm only doing tests for now, so this test resolution is fine. If I was doing a full render of this, I would need to be very careful about making sure my render resolution was matching my undistorted plate resolution if I'm going to composite and add distortion later. PNG format for now is fine. Again, I'm just doing tests. So, right, so if I just kind of bring some kind of light in here, I've got at the moment, I've got no lights at all, so if I render this, it's just going to be black. Right? So let's just create a V-Ray dome light. So if I go into lights and I have a look at my V-Ray dome light, there we are. So that's just going to create me a default V-Ray dome light in my scene. So I just select that and I have a look at my V-Ray dome light shape. It's just got this sort of mainly sort of white, slightly noisy kind of texture that it's going to use to light. So I should at least have some kind of light now. So if I just do a quick sort of test render of this, I hopefully will at least see something appear. Yeah, great, okay. So there's my car, and these kind of things have just got some sort of default texture material on them, and it's actually rendering my background image plane. Now, when I do my final render out of Maya, I definitely don't want that, because I want to do my compositing in an external compositing application like After Effects or Nuke, not do my compositing in Maya. But for test renders right now, it's not bad actually to see that. Right, okay, so that's the default light that I've got. And I may actually just turn on my history here for V-Ray, and can I just save that one temporarily? Yeah, so I've just got that saved, so I can maybe have a look at it later. So now I'm actually going to change my light and swap it out for my HDR light. So my original HDR image here, so what we did was we actually, at the same time we shot that footage, we actually created an HDR panoramic image from some shots we took on set, as it were, at the time. Now typically what we did was we took a variety of exposures, so here's just a kind of slate frame here, and these are images from that location taken with different shutter speeds, so we're getting progressively brighter and brighter, so we're going from sort of massively underexposed with a little color reference chart here for white balancing them to pretty overexposed. And we've shot with a fairly wide angle lens. You can see the kind of distortion in these plates, so it's a pretty wide angle. I think it's about a 10.5mm lens, and we've shot a number of different positions, so probably about 6 or 7 different positions with maybe 7 exposures or something in each one. So we've got about, you know, in the region of 50 exposures, and we stitch those together using PT GUI, great stitching application, to make an HDR image. So what we actually got out of that, you know, once we stitch them all together, this is a JPEG low resolution panorama, but it kind of shows you the kind of thing that we've got. So we've got this 360-degree panorama of the scene, looking pretty nice. Now that obviously, the JPEG is pretty useless for CG lighting purposes, because it doesn't capture the range of exposure that we want to act as an image-based light in Maya. But basically the HDR image is showing the same thing, but capturing a much wider range of exposure. It's also a much bigger image, so that's a 23.7 meg. My radiance file is about 300 meg, so if I preview that, it will take a little bit longer to show up here on my monitor, because it's reading in a few hundred megabyte file, then trying to preview that. I can see that there. The initial view will look a slightly different exposure, but this one's actually captured a much wider range of exposure. It's also a pretty big image, so this one will be quite a number of pixels wide. I think the default image information for this, if we just take a quick look, this one is actually a 13,500 by 5,300 pixel image, so that's about a about a 65, probably a bit above, megapixel image. Now this is a bit overkill, so I don't really need an image that's that big. So what I'm actually going to do is open that up in Photoshop, make it a bit smaller. The reason being that the larger the file size of that image, the longer it's going to take to actually render it. So if I have a super high-res image, my frames are going to take forever to render. I don't really want that. So I'm just going to go to Photoshop or any other application that can save HDR images. Photoshop obviously can. And I just want to resize that to a lower resolution. So I'm going to maybe say, okay, let's go for about 4,000 pixels wide. Yep. It'll automatically keep the same aspect ratio. It's going to be quite a bit smaller file. So 4,000 pixels by that. Okay. Maybe just double click that. There we go. So it's still pretty high resolution. It's still about a 4K video frame. So it's still pretty decent. And I'm going to save that out. I need to make really sure that it's still a radiance file. If I save this as a JPEG or something crazy, then obviously I'm going to lose all of that HDR data. So I'm going to call that help 4K underscore HDR and save it in the same folder. Okay, I could use the big image as the image-based light in Maya, but it's just going to up my render times unnecessarily. So let's just swap this out then. So there's my scene. I've got my V-Ray light dome, so I'm going to use that light, but rather than using this default texture now, we can just say use dome text, and then it's going to say, right, what dome text do you want to use? I'm just going to click this to bring in a map. So it says, okay, my various choices. Obviously I want to use a file, so it's going to let me use a file. So then I want to actually pick the file, so I'm just going to select this folder here and choose my HDR file. So that is in my kind of pipeline type structure. So on the desktop here in Lab 3, that's my project name. Under my Scene 1, under Shot 1, all my sort of assets for the shot that aren't the actual footage are in Shoot. So it'll be an HDR and then RC car, and then I've got all the bits of my HDR, so the raw files, TIFFs, the PTGO project, but it's the actual HDRs I want. And I'm going to use that lower res 4K file rather than the 300 meg original. Okay, perfect. So that's brought in that map. Eventually I'll get an updated sample in here or something like that. So let's just have a quick test render of that. So if I just do a quick test render instead with V-Ray, it's going to look quite different. Yep. So that that light there is, I'm getting a nice sort of specular highlights there from the sun, from the direction there. Very different kind of quality of image. So let's bring it. Now, of course, what I don't get is I just get an initial default intensity for that light, and I've either got two choices. I can either just sort of guess the intensity, which is going to take quite a lot of tweaking, but you can see roughly how we would do that. So if I just kind of temporarily close my render view, press escape here just to stop V-Ray rendering. So I could go back into my outliner. There we go. I could scroll down and find my light dome. There it is. And I could just kind of up this intensity. Yep. And then I could try re-rendering. Yep. So V-Ray's progressive renderer. So it's now a much brighter version of that scene. Now, here I've just kind of manually tweaked this. Ideally, what I would have is some kind of reference image. So this kind of background plate here, what you would ideally have at this stage is another image you could bring in with something like a chrome ball that you'd shot with the same camera with the same settings as the main shot, and obviously that chrome ball would give us a good reference for intensity. So what we could do is, perhaps rather than this car, we could create a sphere in Maya and give it a material that was essentially 100% reflective with no diffuse essentially, and then that fake chrome sphere we could then use this HDR light and render it, and it should kind of match the intensity of the background image with an actual chrome sphere. And so your kind of fake chrome sphere would match the real chrome sphere, and you can keep tweaking the intensity then of your light so that you actually get them matching pretty well. Once you know the intensity is correct, then you could just bring any other object in and you'd think, okay, this should now be matching pretty well. But for the moment I've just kind of tweaked this manually to about 2. Right, Okay, that's great. So we've got a little test render there. So that's fine. So we can get that coming in here. If, by the way, you don't want this actual background image plane to render, you can just select it in the viewport there, or in the perspective view, or from the attribute editor. Just set your display mode rather than RGBA. Just set that to none. So obviously that image plane will still be there. It just won't be displaying, and it won't show up in the render. Yep. What you will see, in the case of V-Ray at least, Arnold behaves a little bit differently, is you will see your light in the background. So that was invisible before because the image plane in Maya was covering it up. But now we're actually seeing our HDR light dome in the render, which in some cases you may actually want, but it's quite possible you really don't actually want it, and it's going to come in. Now it's also going to come in at an initial default orientation, and it may be that the orientation, well in fact it almost certainly will be unless you're very lucky, come in an orientation that is not actually what you want. So if I just again briefly kind of just look at this and how we might fix that. Okay, so I'm seeing a very different thing in the background here from what I did. So I know that in my original image it kind of had this in the background. Now when I shot my HDR, if I look at my my JPEG images here of it, so if I go to scene 1, I go to shot 1, I go to my shoot, go to my HDR, there we are, where's my JPEG, there we are. So I know that I was seeing kind of this little blue thing over here in the background of the image, whereas actually I know that it must have shot this bit, which is my camera was probably over here pointing towards this bit, so I should be seeing really this bit behind my camera. Otherwise everything's kind of, all the reflections are going to be kind of wrong because everything's coming from the wrong direction. So I probably want to rotate my HDR around a little bit in Maya, so because it's kind of in the wrong place. So if I look in my perspective view, you can see I don't really see my light dome in the perspective view. It's really kind of more in the render that I'm actually seeing it. If I look at my outliner here and I just select my light dome, I can see there it is. There's my sample there. Now if I want to rotate that around, the kind of obvious thing to do is to take this V-Ray light dome and rotate that, so probably around the y-axis. So if I do a 90-degree rotate around the y-axis, and I then go and have a look through my render camera again, and I just turn off this image plane shape here, so let's just turn that off again. Yep. And I do a quick re-render. So I've rotated this 90 degrees, so I'm expecting to see a very different thing behind my car here. Yep. You'll notice that what you see is exactly the same. Yep. So actually just rotating the kind of light dome shape in the channel box doesn't actually rotate it at all. Right? So you actually have to do something a little bit different. So if I go back to my light dome and I go back to here, I can see it's got that rotate there, so that is useless. Yep. So, but if you look at your V-Ray light dome shape, you can see over here you actually have a V-Ray place environment text here. Yeah? And here you have your horizontal and vertical rotations, and these are actually the things that make a difference. Yep. So I can't remember, is it going to be a horizontal rotate? Well, let's just try a horizontal rotate. It depends if it's rotating horizontal or around that axis. So I'm just going to try 90-degree horizontal rotate, do a quick re-render, and is that kind of, it's going to give me something different. Ah, yes, this is looking much better. Yep. So this is now rotating this around. I'm seeing those windows in the shot. Slightly different magnification, but I'm not worried about that. So things are now coming round from more the right direction. I'm now seeing the kind of thing that I did before. So the direction of all the light should be much better. So just remember, you need to kind of tweak your rotation there. Right, so that's fine for now as a preview. Now, in my particular case, I don't want the light showing up. So I don't want the light actually rendering. I do want it functioning as a light, but I don't want it to appear in the background of my render, because when I composite, really coming out of Maya, all I really want is the car plus any shadows it might be casting, and if I had made any other geometry that I wanted to have in the finished shot, that as well. But pretty much in my case, the car and the shadow, and that's it. So I'm just going to go back to my V-Ray light dome, go to the V-Ray light dome shape here. So you can actually set your light, if you look at the options, to be invisible. So that's quite important. So if you don't want the actual light dome image to show up in the render, you need to set that to invisible. The light is still functioning as a light, so it's still lighting the scene, it's just not showing up in the render. So if I re-render that now, you'll see that this kind of background is just going to be black, but it's still functioning as a light, still looking exactly how I want it to look. Fantastic. So that's great. So I can see that in this scene, if I look carefully, the car is casting shadows onto the ground because we've got a ground plane in there, and these other objects, they're also casting shadows onto the ground. Yeah. So, but I don't really want these grey boxes coming out of Maya. This geometry is only really there for a couple of reasons. One, so that the car can cast shadows onto it, because obviously in the finished shot I'm going to combine this with my video footage, and the car wasn't there, and because the car wasn't there originally, it wasn't casting any shadows onto anything, but it should do if it's going to look realistic. And the other reason I've got some of this geometry in here, because it could be casting shadows onto these walls, is so that I know where I can put the car and where I can animate it. So, there's no point in me putting the car in the middle of this wall, because that would look super fake when compositing it later. But if I put it here, I know, yeah, this is where there was some ground, and I can have it driving around here, and it's all going to look fairly good in the finished composite. But I don't really want these objects rendering. So, what we would do in that case is we'd actually select these objects. So we can select all of them or just one of them and add them later. I'll just start with the ground, let's say. So I'm going to select the ground, and again this is V-Ray specific, this bit. So I'm then going to say, right, let's create a V-Ray object property. So I'm going to add a single object properties node to the selection, so to the ground. Yep. And so now in my outliner I'm going to get a V-Ray object properties here. Yep. So I'm just going to select that, and you can see there is a thing called ground plane, which is that object. So what it's actually done is I've got that exists somewhere up here, so there it is, that's ground plane, and it's now kind of assigned this V-Ray object properties to that object. Yep. So I might rename that to be V-Ray matte shadow or something like that. Objects. Yep. So because I'm going to make these things just something that receives shadows, so V-Ray matte shadow objects. So my ground plane is got that. Now I'm just going to take a quick look at what that actually does. So it's given me these V-Ray object properties, so I can set all sorts of useful things in here. So you can set things like, is this object visible or not? So if I wanted to hide it for some reason, I could turn off the primary visibility. Is it visible in reflections or refractions? All sorts of good stuff. So let's just make this a matte surface, right, and do nothing else. Yep. So this object is now a matte surface. So if I render this now, you can see, bang, this object has now disappeared. The car is still there, these other two objects, because they haven't been assigned that, are a matte surface. So it's almost like it's gone completely. But if we have a quick look in here, and we actually have a look at the alpha, let's see what the alpha channel is. Right? So the alpha channel of the scene at the moment is that all of the 3D objects, because I can just about see the aerial at the top of the car there, so all of those exist in the alpha channel. Now, what I eventually want is, I want the car to exist in the alpha channel because I want to composite the car into a finished shot. Remembering that everything that's white in this alpha channel is going to be opaque, everything that's black is transparent, anything that's midway between the two is partially transparent. So I want the car to be white, and I want where the shadow of the car is to kind of be either white or grey, a bit of semi-transparency, but I don't want this actual object here to show up. This ground plane shouldn't exist in my alpha channel. So I'm actually going to change some of these properties. So the first thing is I'm going to want to say, right, let's set this alpha to not be 1, but I'm actually going to set it to -1, so that it cuts out essentially this shape from the alpha. And I'm also going to say that I want this to kind of be casting shadows, and for the shadows to affect the alpha. I can give the shadows a tint if I want, but I don't really. So let's just kind of re-render this again. Now the main render is probably not going to look super different. If I look at the RGB channels, the car's still there, that object is still black, and that these two objects are still the same because we haven't done anything with them. But if I look in my alpha, I can see, hey presto, the car is now there. This object, however, is largely now rendering transparent. I'm getting some weird shadows kind of cast in here and stuff like that. But basically, this is now behaving a bit more like I want. The car is there, but this plane is basically not rendering with a solid alpha. It's rendering with a partially transparent alpha, and where the shadows are, it's much more solid. It's nearer white. Right, so let's just apply the same thing to these other two objects because I want them to be similar. I don't really want them showing up in the render either, so they kind of need to also not appear in the finished thing. Also, notice how noisy these shadows are. We'll fix that in a minute as well. It's kind of really, really noisy. So let's just close that. So what I'm just going to do is just make my outliner a little bigger, and I can just sort of maybe drag this. Might just drag this up here a little bit. No, I can't really move that one. Let's just take the, let's say the other walls. Where are they? Let's make this a little bigger. So I've got my right wall. So if I just take the right wall and I middle mouse drag it down to that V-Ray matte shadow, it'll actually add that to that group. And the same with that left wall, I could just middle mouse drag that and put that in the same group. So that means obviously any property I change on that V-Ray matte shadow object there will be applied to all of those three things. I could have created their own V-Ray objects for them and given them unique different properties, but I want them all to behave the same way, so they've all got the same one. Okay, great. So now if I re-render this, I'm going to get the RGB is going to look different now because now they're matte shadow materials. Those boxes are now disappearing. So I'm now just getting the car and a shadow. It will be rendering a shadow, but the shadow is black on a black background. So in this RGB view, I can't really see it. I can only really tell it's there by looking at the alpha. And here I can see, great, now I'm just getting this car and this shadow alpha channel on the ground. So this is looking pretty good. So the shadow, however, is still pretty noisy. Now you can fix that in V-Ray quite easily. This is because the default render anti-aliasing technique in V-Ray is to give you a quick preview, but not necessarily the most accurate preview. So when you're working on it, you need to just be a little bit aware of that, and you might want to fix that occasionally. So the sampler type that V-Ray uses is quite important to have correct. So I'm just going to close that. So my render settings here, under my V-Ray options, so I've got the common options. It's this V-Ray tab here, and it's this image sampler. Now the default is progressive. You really want that turned on most of the time when you're doing tests because it gives you the fastest response in the render view. But adaptive is a lot more accurate, and particularly if you've got soft shadows for your final renders, you are going to want it on adaptive, not on progressive. Progressive, as I say, great for tests, but it's not very good for finished quality renders. So if I just do a quick preview of the render here, you can see a little bit how this is going to work. So it's not going to render the same way at all as it used to. It's going to now render in buckets, and it's going to be quite quick, thus the adaptive, where there's really nothing going on, but it's going to be a lot slower to render where there is more work to do. So if I look at my alpha here, you can begin to see probably as it's going over here, it's going to start doing a lot smoother job. So you can already see a lot of the noise has got eliminated, and you can see under the tyre here, this shadow is much better in detail than the progressive, really noisy shadow that I was getting instead. So it's going to give us really much nicer looking shadows from the adaptive render, so definitely use that for your final quality. So I'm just going to briefly escape that again here, and I'm just going to turn my camera image plane back on. So if I just go into my, I could do this various ways. Let's go to our perspective view, maybe just select my camera, go to my image plane shape, and I'm just going to turn this back on just so I can see it again in the camera. Now again, I wouldn't want to be doing this for a finished render, but just as a quick test, it will show us roughly what's going on here. So if we just do a quick render of this scene now, we know our alphas would be doing the right thing with that shadow there. But now it's just going to render. It's going to render using the image plane background. We're going to get the car in the render, and we're going to get some nice soft shadows. So this is even with quite a low res render, a 960 by 540 res image, and we can see even to render out that background image plane is taking a few seconds. Now this is just, as I said, as a test out of Maya. For your final renders, you don't want to render the image plane, you want to comp that in Nuke or whatever. But we should be able to see the car and the kind of ground plane shadows coming in there and looking fairly decent. So just remember to set it to adaptive on the render. Make sure you've got your geometry set as matte surface materials. You want to make sure your alpha contributions set to -1, shadows and effect alphas both checked. You want to make sure your V-Ray light dome is rotated the right amount in your scene, so that it's actually going to be casting, you know, the kind of bright areas onto the right parts of your object. And there we are. We can see the tires looking pretty good there, and no doubt the ground shadow is going to come in a minute. Yep, so we can start to see the ground shadow under these wheels here is looking pretty decent. Yep, and that's just going to give us quite a nice render coming out of that. So there we go. So that's setting up your HDR light in V-Ray, making sure the light itself didn't render, how to sort of turn on off your background image plane shape, look at some of the render settings for V-Ray, so we can see this ground shadow under the cars coming in here pretty nicely, and a quick look at that. Now, as I say, I'll do another one of these looking at some of the differences between V-Ray and Arnold. A lot of the procedures are going to be very similar, but we'll look at some of the slight Arnold tweaks. Okay, but I'll leave that one there for now. So thanks for watching, and you can see the car's pretty much finished there. It's looking pretty decent in the scene. Okay, thank you very much.